Hello, yoga teachers who both root and rise. Root to Rise is the intersection between self-inquiry, rooting, and teaching extraordinary yoga classes, rising. Welcome, my name is Sheri Fisher. I'm one of the founders of Root to Rise. The Root to Rise yoga teaching method bridges the gap between your 200-hour yoga teacher training and teaching extraordinary classes no matter how much experience you have. If you've taught yoga at all, or you've taught for a while, you know that some weird stuff can happen in a yoga class. And we're going to talk about that today. My guest today is Tess McInnis. She was my yoga teacher trainer. She created the teacher training, and then she taught another 10 yoga teacher trainings. She has practiced yoga for over 20 years, and she has taught over 3,000 hours of yoga. So if some weird stuff has happened, Tess has probably seen that weird stuff happen. So let me go ahead and bring in Tess. Welcome, Tess. How are you today?
Hi, Sheri. Thanks for having me. I'm doing well. How are you?
I am so good. And I am really excited about this topic that we're going to be talking about because my guess is you've seen some weird stuff happen when you've been teaching yoga, when you owned the studio for over 10 years. There's just stuff that happens at a yoga studio. And as a yoga teacher, which our viewers are yoga teachers, we need to be prepared to be able to handle stuff like this. So what are some of the things that you would classify as weird or just something that you as a teacher needed to address? What is it? What's the range of those?
Yeah, thanks. I think you've got the everyday kind of smaller stuff that happens, and it happens somewhat regularly. If you've got students that say pass gas in class, all the way to some more extreme things that may be extreme and kind of unordinary but not dangerous, and then you've got situations that all of a sudden are dangerous and you need to act accordingly with some of those things. So, some of the more common things that are probably going to happen more regularly than not. You're going to have students that are, say, like someone passes gas in class, and how do you handle that? And in those situations, a lot of the time, it's just better not to acknowledge it. It doesn't matter. You don't need to call them out. It happened. They know it happened. Their neighbors know it happened. We're all adults. It's not that big of a deal. Move on, just continue teaching. And usually if you are able to guide that and sort of lead by example in that, everybody else it's out of mind within 15 seconds for them as well. So that's good.
Yeah, I think there are those things that are more common than not. And probably the yoga teachers that we're talking to now have experienced some of those either as a student or as a teacher. What maybe would be one of the extreme things, one of the more challenging things that you've had to deal with as a teacher, something that's happened in class or maybe something that's happened within your studio?
Sure, yeah. I think the most extreme thing that's ever happened to me, and this was probably, I'd only owned the studio for a couple of years at that point, was that I was giving a message on non-judgment in one of the classes. And I think I was talking about Miley Cyrus at the time. I think this was when everybody was giving her a really hard time because of the whole twerking thing. And the message that I was trying to give was, we were all 18 at one point. We've all done silly things and done really like things, but the difference is we weren't in the worldwide media about it. And so maybe can we find a little space to just ease up on some of the judgment? And I had a gentleman who did not believe or agree, did believe that was true and did not agree with me on that at all. And which is fine, by the way, but he chose to go about it in a pretty inappropriate way. He stood up in the middle of class and challenged me and told me that that wasn't okay. And I do remember exactly what he said, but he was challenging me in front of the class. And I had to really quickly sort of diffuse and then divert the situation just so that it wasn't, completely disruptive and completely stop the class altogether. And from there, I just had to then not only figure out kind of on my feet how to diffuse and divert, but then also how to post-class set some boundaries with him to make sure that that didn't happen again, because that was not okay.
So you did pull him aside afterward and say, here's what just unfolded and here's maybe why it disrupted other students. And if you do have some concerns about something, here's a better way to approach me with that.
Exactly. And which, it ended up, so yes, there was conversation after class and there was quite a bit of kind of back and forth. And what it kind of came down to is that I made it clear to him that it was okay for him to disagree with me. And if he wanted to talk about those things out of class, that was okay. But if it bothered him enough to not come to my class, then that was okay too. But what was not okay was to come to my class and disrupt the class by kind of challenging me and kind of making a scene in the middle of class. That was now affecting the other students, and that just wasn't okay. And in the end, he decided that he would not be able to come to my classes without challenging me in class. And so I had to draw the boundary and say, well, then you are not welcome to come to my classes, unfortunately. And then it kind of just ended from there.
And just so our viewers know, Tess and I have put together a tip sheet, and this addresses the first tip, which Tess, one of the tips that you gave was approach all students with compassion and a focus on customer service. And it sounds like in that very challenging situation, you were doing a really good balance between that. You were trying to protect the students that were around him, that were trying to just have a really nice, normal practice, but you were also recognizing that he had some feelings about it, and you wanted to find a way for him to be able to address them or at least solve the problem. So is there anything more on that tip that you would like to say in regard to this situation or any other situations?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in your classes, I think it's important. It depends where you're teaching and the style that you're teaching and all and like who your audience is and things like that. But I think we have to be careful as yoga instructors, especially this day and age, on pushing beliefs onto students. And I think that there's a difference between pushing very specific beliefs versus generally talking about sort of the yoga philosophy of non-judgment, non-attachment, kindness, and all of those really good things that are sort of like universally looked kindly upon. So I think we just need to be careful about making sure that we're giving a message that's pretty broad and general, but still at that point, even knowing that there may be some people that don't understand that. But I think that we do have to be careful about any messaging that may be too one-sided or another. You don't want to be political in your classes by any means or anything like that. So.
And in our book, How to Be That, Standing Room Only, How to Be That Yoga Teacher, we talk about that in the first pillar, which is the pillar on communication and knowing who's in your audience. And so if you are bringing up anything that could be misconstrued or possibly somebody misunderstands how you're bringing it up, what you're talking about are those real general topics that we can talk about from a yogic perspective. But anytime we start to add any politics or opinion into it, we kind of start getting into a gray space that maybe is not appropriate for the yoga studio. So before we move on to my next question for you, let me just ask the viewers, give us some examples, maybe in the comments below, about different challenging situations that you've had and how you have been able to balance having the compassion for the student, but also understanding that you as a yoga teacher have needs, the students around the student have needs, and the student, he or her or himself, also have needs. So talk to us a little bit about how you can balance that, and you can just leave comments below. So Tess, back to you. I have a question for you. This one I hope will be a little lighter. What's the funniest thing that's happened in a yoga class? And how did you handle it?
I had this gentleman in my class. He was a little bit older, not that that matters, but he was just the cutest little older man that you ever. He was just the nicest, sweetest, kind of ridiculous human being ever, but he was just lovely. I absolutely loved him. And we had one class where he stood up in the middle of class because he couldn't do, I think, what was happening at the time. And I don't remember what the pose was, but he decided what would be a better option for him at that time would be to just start walking in laps around the class. And he had these like foam dumbbells, and he was like doing the lifting while he was walking in laps. And this was like a tiny studio too, so it was very awkward. People were sort of like, what is happening? And even at that point, it wasn't that big of a deal. It was more just something that you kind of noticed and, kind of looked at him and realized, well, he was okay. There was nothing dangerous about the situation, and it was a little unusual, but it was noticeable to the other students, but it wasn't ridiculously disruptive. So it was sort of like, well, okay, you do you. And when you're ready to come back to your mat, we'll be here waiting for you. So that was pretty funny. And, I never did say anything to him about you shouldn't do that or you can't do that, because I could sense that it wasn't a big enough distraction. If it was really a distraction, I probably would have said, hey, this is not the place to be walking laps around the studio. But in that particular time and with the students that there and the general student body that was coming to my studio at the time, people didn't mind. And so it really wasn't worth addressing, but it was pretty funny.
And it's those stories that are so funny to me. I think you told me a story once where it was really hot, the room was really packed, and a man stood up and said, "There's no oxygen in here." And you said, "There is. Sit down on your mat. We're fine. I'm talking, so there has to be oxygen in here."
Yeah. He was standing up, and he just looked at me. He was like, "There's no oxygen in here." And I said, there is, just breathe. You have oxygen. It's okay. And he's like, oh yeah, okay. I just had to remind him that he could breathe. It was okay. So yeah,
Well, and I
yeah.
put this question out on a couple of Facebook groups that have yoga teachers. And one of the funniest, I thought it was funny, but it actually was a real situation, was that there was a rule at the studio that everybody needed to keep their shirts on. And a couple of the gentlemen were not keeping their shirts on. So a woman took her top off and was practicing topless and in protest. And I thought, it could happen. And at the
Mhm.
time, I'm not sure as a yoga teacher what I would do. But I think what you were saying is, and this is one of the other tips that you gave, is it really is a case by case basis. And you have to start taking into account, is it really hurting anything? Are the other students impacted? How would I address this? Is now the appropriate time? Is there anything more you'd like to add to that tip about measuring the situation at the moment and then responding instead of just reacting?
Yeah, I mean, no, I think you covered it. I think there's a time where you can sort of diffuse as needed, only as needed. And then once you've diffused, there are going to be some situations that even it's not your responsibility as the instructor to then talk to the student post class. Sometimes that's got to go up to management, and that's their responsibility to talk to the student. But whatever you can do to sort of diffuse, and more than anything, it's really just about number one, safety, and number two, distraction. So once those two things are within reason, you're good. Then you can kind of figure out how you want to address it after.
I think you bring up another good point, which is as a yoga teacher, what kinds of things do I need to share with the studio owner? Because some things do need to go up to them because they need to understand what's happening. If you weren't in my class and you didn't see it happen, do you need to know? If somebody passes gas, probably not. But
Mm.
if somebody stood up and was challenging me, and maybe you would need to know because other teachers have been coming to you with a similar complaint, and you need to understand that there's a pattern. Do you have any thoughts on yoga teachers and letting the studio owner or manager know what's going on?
Yeah, I think you're right. If it's something where somebody's passing gas, that happens all the time, not a big deal. If it's something that's a little bit out of the ordinary, that's happening with one person in particular, it may be worth bringing it to the manager or the owner, just so that if they hear this consistently and it starts to become an issue, they just have all of the information that they need to then be able to effectively address the situation. But I also think it would be worth bringing up if you start to notice a behavior with more than one student that's a common behavior, because that may be more of a universal issue that is worth having a conversation about. For example, if students are starting to laugh in the middle of class, or if students are starting to do just, I don't know, I can't think of another example off the top of my head, but if they're starting to stand up and say, can you turn the music up, or can you turn the music down? And all of a sudden that becomes a thing where people are like, oh, well, it's okay. Clearly that's okay to do in class. Then it may be worth having a conversation with management, so that as a studio, all the instructors can say, okay, our students have come to this new, have come into this new um, behavior pattern in which they think it's okay to stand up and ask for music. So how are we going to deal with that? Maybe at the beginning of class, we say, if you have an issue with the music, kindly just give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or, you'll figure out how to address it as a studio. So I think those types of situations are also worth bringing up and talking about.
I remember at the studio, we were having a lot of chatter in the studio before class started. And even though there was a sign on the door that said, please remain quiet for the other students. And so something like that is almost more of a culture thing that you need to address from a cultural standpoint, that maybe you bring up when you're having your instructor meeting, and let them know, we do still want the studio to be quiet before and after class. If you could mention that in your announcements, that type of thing. And I think that's what you're referring to. So for our viewers, I would love it if you would share in the comments, what's the funniest thing that's happened to you and how did you handle it? Because some of the comments that I got gathered back from the yoga teachers that were responding to my question, it was quite interesting. And I think it's worth the discussion because this stuff does happen. I mean, it just does happen. So Tess, let's go over to something that maybe is a little more serious. And we were teaching together in a hot yoga studio. And so things can happen because our bodies are working really hard to do these poses, and the heat is up, and how hydrated am I? Did I eat anything today? But when something happens that maybe borders on a health or safety issue, talk to us about that, and maybe a situation, or just even from a teacher standpoint or from a studio owner standpoint, what do we need to look out for in regard to safety and health?
Yeah, that's a really good question. First and foremost, the studio, if they don't already have these protocols in place, they need to. And if they don't, then somebody should talk to the management or studio. So protocols meaning where do we have what kind of CPR equipment do we have on hand? Do we have the machine in the back where we can automatically help get somebody's heart get started if we need to? An understanding of the protocols as far as are the instructors all CPR certified. I know with my studio, absolutely everybody had to be CPR certified and current with that. In addition to that, we had sort of safety trainings once in a while on just to make sure that even though you were already certified, do you remember what to do? And if not, this is how you do it. In addition to that, make sure that you know where the phone in is for a studio owner. I had our address and our information on the phone itself so that if somebody needed to call 911 and they couldn't remember the address, because why would you necessarily know that if you kind of just, it's a small town, you know where you're going, our phone number, our address, all of the information is on the phone itself, and everybody knew that protocol. And then all the way down to just, I mean, those are for serious things, right? Like somebody goes into cardiac arrest, but for smaller things, fairly frequently, you'd have somebody come in, like you said, that didn't eat enough, didn't drink enough, and you can tell as an instructor when somebody gets up, and we kind of learned this in our teacher training too. If somebody gets up, you know the difference between it looks like somebody going to the restroom and somebody who's having a hard time and is leaving the studio. And so when somebody leaves the studio and you're like, something is going, they do not feel well, finding a pose for the class to be in that you can hold them in and that they're okay to be in by themselves. It's not dangerous. I'm not talking, handstand. And allow yourself to leave the room and go see the student, talk to them, what do they need, and having the sugar drinks available at any given moment. I don't know if you remember this in the studio, but we always had a Gatorade, orange juice, apple juice, whatever we needed so that students, if they needed that sugar, could drink that really quickly. They could sit outside and you could make sure they were okay and then kind of check on them as needed. More often than not, after a couple minutes, they would come back into the studio and they were fine. But so the safety is huge, and every studio really needs to have a protocol for the little issues. I've got a little bit of a hypoglycemic episode going on here, all the way to somebody's in cardiac arrest.
And the thing is that you don't know. And so some of it is watching what's happening. Do they dart out of the room? Do they, how are they standing up? It's being aware of what's happening. It's being current, but also being present with your CPR certification. We go there and we do the required, number of pumps and breaths and all that stuff. But it's really taking control of the situation, and it's, making sure that everybody's safe, the person that left perhaps, and everybody else, like you said, get them into a pose that they can hold for a while. And in our book, Standing Room Only, How to Be That Yoga Teacher, in the fourth pillar, we talk about commitment. And it is commitment to, just like you were talking about, keep your CPR certification active. Make sure you know the protocols, the safety protocols of the studio. Make sure you know the address. I know it sounds silly, but a lot of times with the address, you go, yeah, it's next to where the old such and such used to be. And it's like, no, really, where's the address? So it is the little things, but they are very important things. And the other thing I think too, and I think you taught us this in the teacher training, was there probably is another teacher in the room, or maybe another volunteer, a Karmi, that helps with check-in and that type of thing. It's also appropriate, and I have done this in the past, where I'll get the students into their next pose and I'll come and tap Tess on the shoulder and I'll say, hey, Tess, can you go check on Jane, who just walked out? I just want to make sure she's okay. And as a student, if you were to ask me, I'm happy to help in that way so that the teacher can keep teaching, but you have somebody that's checking on the student that left. So, so yeah. And the third tip on Tess's sheet is to make sure if the situation is dangerous, how do you respond? What would you do? And I guess I'm asking you, the viewers now, in a situation that's dangerous, do you know your studio's protocol? Are you ready to take charge if somebody does go down and you don't know if they've passed out, or if they need a blood sugar boost, you don't know? Are you ready to take action and say, okay, let's stop the class. Here's what needs to happen. You do this, you do that, just like we're trained in our CPR training. So, all right. Anything else, Tess, that you would add in regard to the gamut of things that can happen within a yoga studio when you're teaching or when you own the studio?
The only other thing that I would add is allow yourself to be a little bit intuitive and proactive about situations that could happen. So another thing that I would do, in the town that I owned the yoga studio, there's a college. And so sometimes we would get high school or young college people that would come in. And if I saw two girls, I'm just going to say girls, it could be boys, but two young women that came in, and you could tell this was their first time ever doing yoga, and they were like, I knew already that they were going to have a hard time not giggling and laughing through the class. And so to be proactive about that, when I came in to teach the class, I would just kind of say, why don't you come over here? And I would set them up separate from each other, because I was just already just trying to get upstream from that and try and avoid the situation, begin with where they're laughing. And then I have to go up to them, because sometimes you'll have people that are laughing and it's inappropriate. You have to kind of go up to them and kind of give them like, are you okay? And then they kind of get the social cue, like, oh, I guess it's not okay that I'm laughing and nobody else is laughing. And, so trying to know your situations and know your audience. And that just comes with time and getting to know the student body as well. But if you can catch it upstream, all the power to you.
I think that's the power of prevention. And if you see them giggling a lot, maybe in a previous class, but even as they're walking into the studio, a nice reminder, just so you know, in the studio, we try to keep it real quiet before, during, and after practice. So I love that you're enjoying your time together, but I just wanted to make sure that you knew that. And you're catching it before it's a problem. And then it also is something you can refer back to later if it is still a problem. Just say, yeah, that's why I was giving you that warning as you were going in, because a lot of people come here for these reasons. And just reiterating that. So, exactly. All right, Tess, anything else you want to share with us?
That's it. That's all I got for you today.
Oh, I'm telling you, with as much teaching experience as you have, 3,000 hours, you probably have 3,000 examples. So I'm glad you brought us the examples that you did that were challenging, that were funny, and that were also safety and concern. So, all right, Tess, thanks so much. And coming back to me. All right, so now it's time for your coaching challenge. And every time that we do one of these series, I want to bring it back to you, because it's when you take this information and you do something with it when you're teaching yoga that it makes the difference. Hearing it is one thing, but practicing it is another. So from what you heard today, maybe some weird situations that you've encountered as a teacher, thinking about the tips that Tess shared with you today. And remember, you can download that tip sheet, and it should be in our comments, so you can get to that. But download that and think about it. What would you do if this happened? Or what did you do when that happened? And just do some self-reflection. This is how we learn as yoga teachers, and also share it with other yoga teachers, because I learn a lot when I share with other teachers and I say, this happened, this is what I did, what would you do differently? We are our best teachers to share those best practices. So that's your coaching challenge for this week. Actually, for this month. This is all of September. So thank you so much for coming today. Just a couple of reminders. We do have the book Standing Room Only, How to Be That Yoga Teacher, available, and that link is in the show notes, so you can go and download that. And that contains all 5 pillars of powerful teaching. So I hope you'll take advantage of that. Get the tip sheet, do the challenge, the homework, so that you take and integrate this information. And we will see you again in our Facebook group, the Yoga Teacher Gathering Space, where we talk about all things yoga, especially teaching yoga, and gaining more confidence and knowledge so that we are better teachers. So we will see you in the Facebook group, the Yoga Teacher Gathering Space, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks for tuning in.